my grandfather came from Poland. He understood that something bad was happening in Eastern Europe between the two world wars. And he came in his way to America, he just stuck in Portugal. He was arrested in Portugal because they thought he was a communist spy. And when he went out of jail, he said, Portuguese people are really nicer than Ukrainians. And he decided to stay. My mother came from, in the Second World War afterwards, all his family and my grandmother's family was killed in that. I know you've been in Poland. I've been in Poland only for the first time in my life 2 years ago. I was not brave enough to go there and to confront that reality. My kids, they went in the end of school, of high school, the three of them, and now they are in the army. But at that time, I really was not able to confront it. I was, and there is a movie, maybe I'll send it to Ben, with subtitles in English, of my visit to Auschwitz, which was quite a shock when I just discovered 80 relatives of my family that were really killed, assassinated in the beginning of the Second World War, when the Nazis arrived to Poland at that time, today Ukraine, Lutsk. My mother's family, it's a completely different story. It's a Sephardic family from Spain. They were very important with different kings in the past, doctors and physicians and scientists, etc. And they were expulsed from Spain in 1492, as all the Jews were, those who didn't accept to convert into Christianism. And they went to Morocco, to the Spanish Morocco, Tetuan, and they thought it would take 2-3 years, this expulsion, and it took 500 years. But finally, they came back in the 20th century to Spain, and this kind of combination I'm the result of. And I came to Israel when I was 16, to a kibbutz Mishmar Sharon. I came just as a volunteer, and I was in the kibbutz for 2 months. I went to the post. You know, there was something called telegram. I sent a telegram to my parents and I said, stay in Israel. That's it. That's all the money I have for the telegram, because we used to pay by words. And since then I'm here, which is quite a long time ago. I'm a journalist, as Ben said. I'm a professor in the university, in the IDC Herzliya. I tried politics, and maybe I will try again in the future. And I work in worldwide projects with Pope Francis. Being a Jew, I'm very, very close to him. And with the Secretary General of the UN. It's relevant for the Middle East. But mainly, the reason why Ben invited me to speak with you is to give you I would say, the way I see the Middle East changing in the last 8 years since what was called the Arab Spring, since the revolutions in the Arab world. And the truth is, I've been visiting almost every country, not all of them, from Morocco to Iraq. Just last week, I was in Oman with the American ambassador in Oman, a very nice person. And I was invited by the government there to see and to meet. Well, you know, we say these things for an Israeli, it's quite unique. I mean, the status of Israel in the Middle East is changing in a very, very fast and very important way, because we have lots of threats in the Middle East, but we also have lots of opportunities. But I want to take you to a specific date, March 8th, 49, in the last century. There was a session in the parliament in Jerusalem. You've been in Jerusalem, I suppose, in the Knesset, in the parliament. And the person I believe is maybe the bravest leader of the Jewish people ever, David Ben-Gurion, the founder of this country, he went there and he said to all the members of the parliament, my friends, we are 2 days away, apparently, of the end of the Independence Day. We won against all odds. It's quite amazing. We won. But now we are starting the difficult work. Now we are starting really the big challenge. We won. I'm very happy. I'm very proud. But to build a state is much more complicated. The routine of building a state when you have 600,000 inhabitants, that's all. That was the population, the Jewish population of this country, the moment he declared the independence. And he knew, by the way, and that's the amazing thing, I know it from first hand because you heard about Shimon Peres, who was really his in a way, Ben-Gurion was his mentor, and I was very close to Shimon Peres. I started writing his biography, his last biography. I used to meet him every week, and he used to tell me many things about Ben-Gurion. And he said, imagine the situation in 47, 48. There is a political leader, Ben-Gurion, who must decide if he declares the independence. Now, half of the population at that time, remember this detail, half of the Jewish population, 300,000, were survivors of the Holocaust. Now, they were wounded in their bodies, they were wounded in their minds, they were post-traumatic, many of them. And with this kind of people, he would need to declare the independence and to defend the country, because he knew the day after Israel would be attacked by 6 armies, 6 Arab armies. So it was quite a challenge. How to survive? He didn't have almost weapons, and he started trying to bring weapons from wherever it was possible. So it was quite a challenge. But now, March 8th, 49, after 10 months of war, he said, we conquered Eilat. Eilat is the southern part, the southern city of Israel. It was called Rashrash. We just conquered Eilat, and now we start the hard work. And then Peres, about this, said to me, imagine if Ben-Gurion would just come back for 10 minutes now, and look what happened to Israel 71 years later. He would be in shock. Because what happens today, and I'll give you another example. When I arrived to Israel, to the kibbutz in the end of the 70s, it was like, for me, coming from Portugal. I didn't come from the States, a very developed and rich country. I came from Portugal, which was a quite humble country at that time. And even like this, I remember my shock when I saw how Israel was then, in the end of the 70s. It looked to me like Albania. Because I went to the supermarket and there was one type of bread and one type of cheese. I remember that very well. I remember watching the cars in the street. It looked to me like Havana today in Cuba, you know? Those cars, 400,000 kilometers, that they can't buy new cars, so they try to make them work. It was quite amazing, that feeling of a very, very simple and modest country. Today, I mean 40 years afterwards, Israel is a kind of a superpower. In the military point of view, last week in Oman, one of the leaders said to me, you know, for us, Israel is the strongest country in the Middle East, from the Caspian Sea to Gibraltar. So that's how the Arab world today sees Israel. Sorry. We're going to try to solve this anyway. Just 1 second, because if not, they can't film it. So that's the military point of view, but there are many other aspects that they see Israel today as a superpower. And I'm going to tell you, when we are 71, what are the big achievements maybe, but also what are the big challenges we have, including the challenges in this complicated neighborhood called Middle East, where we lived, where we are located. And you know, location, 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 that's the most important thing. And we have a certain problem, but we have also certain opportunities. But going back to Peres, when he said to me, imagine if Ben-Gurion would come for 10 minutes. He would be really surprised. Why? Because today, many leaders in the world, in every continent, I would say we have from Europe, from Africa, from South America, from Asia, they want to come to Israel. They are asking the Israeli government to receive those leaders to visit Israel, and the government has no chance to find time in the schedule, because it's a full schedule. Why do they want to come to Israel? All of them, most of them. Because of the 3 T's. Remember this. 3 T's. The first T is, somebody can guess?
Technology.
Sorry? Yes.
Technology.
Absolutely. Technology. Now, you heard about technology, I suppose. You heard about the fact that in the NASDAQ in the United States, Israel, less than 9 million people country, has more startup companies than the whole European Union together, 28 countries. More than many, many superpowers in the world. So it happened because of, because of many reasons. Because of the army, it's one of the good reasons. I recommend you to read the book, Startup Nation. It explains very well how Israel became really the center of technology in many, many aspects. After the United States, I think is the #1 today in the world. And everybody comes here to learn about new technologies and to take them home. Many of them, by the way, I see with my kids in the army, when they leave the army, they get a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, so they bring the technologies they learned in the army to the civil life, but they continue in the reserve. So in a way, there is a kind of relation all the time between the army and the civil life, and it brings all these technologies to the civil society, and then they are sold everywhere in the world. I think Israel has something like 5,000 startups, a country with less than 9 million inhabitants. So technology is the first thing. The second thing, the second T, can you guess? Something that affects everyone today in the Western world.
Trade.
Sorry?
Trade.
Well, trade is important for sure. Treat. I wish. Terror, absolutely, absolutely. You know, in the last, I had the chance to meet all the leaders of Hamas since the creation of the organization. They didn't know at the beginning I'm a Jew and an Israeli. Today, they know everything because everything is in Google. So, you know, I call it Sheikh Google. So everybody knows everything, almost everything. It's not written that I'm an officer in the army. That's the only thing that is not written. I believe in the reserve. Anyway, the truth is that the terror is a problem that Israel, unfortunately, is an international, a worldwide expert, and many people come here to learn what happened, how Israel deals with terror. Now, I can tell you, and I will develop this if you want, only 2 years ago, I went with the Kurdish army, the Peshmerga, inside Mosul, the second city in Iraq. And the moment that ISIS was defeated, and they went out of Mosul. It was my 4th time in Iraq, and I really saw the war also of the coalition, of the international coalition. It was quite amazing going inside Mosul and seeing how they are defeating ISIS, not only the Kurds, the Peshmerga, which are, in my opinion, real heroes. They got really this war. They defeated, first of all, Daesh, the Islamic State, ISIS. But anyway, the strange thing was to see their officers and soldiers from 75 countries together, working together. The Pope told me something quite amazing. He said to me, I believe this is a kind of third world war, he said. Because even against the Nazis, there was no coalition with this level, with this range of countries, 75 countries, including 10 Arab countries, that were there, pilots, officers, soldiers, working together to defeat one only enemy. And I remember a general, an American general, I'm not going to say his name because I don't think he gave me the permission, but anyway, he was leading the forces, a very, very smart person. I met him many times, and he said to me, look, we have our strategy, which is drones, loans, and phones. Drones, because, you know, the American army thinks that some thousands of militants, of terrorists, of ISIS were killed with drone attacks, which were really day and night. You could see it. The general of the Kurds took me to ISIS prisoners, and I had the chance to talk with them for 2 hours and a half. And one of them spoke perfect English with a British accent because he had a private teacher in Raqqa, in his city in northern Syria. And we had a very long conversation. And I remember during this conversation, he was just a prisoner after a battle of 18 hours. And they were like trembling. I don't know if because of drugs or because of the adrenaline. But I remember they heard a kind of a noise, and immediately they looked upstairs because they thought it was a drone coming to attack them. So they were really obsessed. I have the feeling that the drones were a key factor to defeat ISIS during this 4 or 5 years fight against them. The second thing was the economic war, what he called loans, which was, it took quite a time until the moment they did it, all the coalition, the international coalition, but it was critical because at the beginning ISIS had all the money they wanted. And the third thing was what was called phones. I believe we still have there quite a work to do, which is fighting against the narrative that ISIS was developing and bringing to the world and recruiting youngsters from the Muslim world to come to Syria and to Iraq to support them. I believe they did an incredible, I have a course in university called the Digital Caliphate, which is exactly that, how they used the technology, the modern technology, to attract youngsters from all over the world, thousands of them, to come to Syria and to Iraq, and nobody is really developing an answer, a response to this kind of narrative war done by ISIS, which was a big success. Ziad, the prisoner of ISIS, told me, you know, maybe we'll disappear, but we already won. And I said to him, why? He said, because our idea is everywhere, in the Middle East, in Europe, in America, in the triangle of borders in South America. And we have our digital materials that we developed all these years that are there in different languages. And they will be for the future for those who will pick up this idea, this jihadi idea, and will continue even if we disappear. But they didn't disappear. They were kicked out from Syria and Iraq almost in 100%. I believe some cells still are there in the border. But anyway, they are today in different places like Sinai, in Egypt, like Libya. I believe they still work there, Afghanistan, Indonesia, etc., etc., etc. So they didn't disappear. They still are there. And by the way, in Syria, we still have 20,000 men, apparently, of Al-Qaeda, who are armed. But you know why you don't hear about them? Because they are not online like ISIS. Their policy is completely different. They are offline. So the second T is terror, and they are still there. And I believe I just wrote a book about that in Europe. Now it's going to be published here. And I believe that's something that we are going to leave, a new kind of terror maybe, a low-tech terror done by groups. I recommend you to read the recommendations of Abu Musab al-Suri. Abu Musab al-Suri is the ideological mentor of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And he's saying, okay, we can't organize an attack like 9/11 every week or every year. It's very complicated, logistically, very dangerous, very risky. Let's go to the kitchen of our mother and take a knife. Let's take the cars of our father, and let's kill infidels every day, everywhere. And that's the new policy that we can see in the last years in Europe, in other places. Ben asked me to speak with you also about what's going on in Europe. And we'll get there in the questions and we'll develop. So the second T is terror. You know what is the third T?
Tradition.
No.
Time.
Sorry?
Time.
No. Your president, Trump. The feeling that many leaders in the world have that the keys to the White House are in Jerusalem. And so they come here to ask the Israeli Prime Minister, in many cases, please help us with President Trump. Now, it's true that I don't believe Israel and the United States were always very, very close allies, but we are maybe in the golden age in that point of view today. So it's true there is a very close relation, and it's important to have, to develop this relation. And many people in the world see it as the third T that is also vital for them. So everybody would be surprised to see Israel having today, in 2019, a GDP per capita. You know, that's the wealth divided into 9 million inhabitants, higher than Japan, higher than Italy, higher than France, higher than Spain, and almost higher than Great Britain, very soon apparently, with the Brexit. So Israel became really also in that point of view, a kind of a superpower. Now, it's true, you can find it on the net. The achievements are really incredible. The proportions of students in the university, of people working in many fields, not only technology, on medicine, and all kind of technologies that are developed. But here we have a very big but. Something happened to the Israeli economy in this very fast development in the last 40 years. Some people were forgotten, and they went and they stayed in the very basic economy of the 70s and the 80s of the last century. Israel has 20% of people who live under the line of poverty. Even if today Israel has a very, very developed economy. So this is one of the challenges that I believe we are going to have here in the future, and we are going to have to develop and to deal with, how to close those very big gaps that were created with the development of the Israeli economy in the last years. We have other challenges. One of them is, you asked General Zucker before one question. I wanted to tell you that in Israel, that you said one general, Gershon, I think, said something and he said something else. I wanted to tell you, they say in Israel that two Jews have always three opinions. So, you know, polemic is part of the DNA of the Jewish people and of the state of Israel. It happens in the army. You can see sometimes low-rank officers saying, but I think we should do this and that. I was in an American carrier in the Harry Truman in the war in Iraq, and I saw how it works perfectly. It's like a machine, and I imagine if it was Israel, there would be debates between the generals and the soldiers how to do things and how to develop things, because that's part of the Israeli character. That's also the force of Israel, but also the weakness in both sides, and we must take this into account. Anyway, when we speak about the Israeli society, we have here what our president, Reuven Rivlin, calls the Jewish tribes of Israel. We have four main groups in the Israeli society that are almost like parallel lines. We have the secular population, which is a very bad name because I belong theoretically to the secular population, and I'm not secular, I'm traditionalist as a Jew. But anyway, okay, we call it the secular population. We have the ultra-Orthodox population, the Haredi population, which are between 8 and 10% of the population. We have the national religious population, less than 20%, and the Arabs of Israel, the Arab Palestinian of Israel, who vote like me to the Knesset, to the parliament, who pay taxes, who work, they are in universities. Oh, okay. They are in universities, they are in the hospitals, they are everywhere. They are part of the society. The only difference is they don't do the military service, normally only if they are volunteer. And by the way, today, there are more and more volunteers coming from the Arab society to go to the army, which is quite amazing. I just met a Christian leader in Jerusalem who is an Israeli, and he himself, he said only from his community in the last year there were some hundreds of volunteers going to the army because it's a way of being part of the Israeli society. So we have these 4 tribes. I add a 5th tribe, which is the Jewish diaspora, 8 million Jews who live everywhere, and I say, how do we bring them together? How do we create a common denominator for them? But there is something related with Palestinians and what you were talking before. We are the only country in the world without recognized borders. And we need to recognize those borders. We have recognized borders with Egypt and with Jordan because we have peace agreements with them, but we don't have them both with Syria and with the Palestinians. And here, I believe the parameters of the borders that Israel will define in the next decade, in the next generation, should keep 2 principles. One, being a Jewish country. That's the only Jewish country in the world. So I hope it will have a Jewish majority. This is one of the parameters. And the second one is being democratic. Israel is the only democratic country in this world, in this Middle East. I remember when the Palestinians used to be a democracy at the beginning. They had elections with international observers. The last elections in the Palestinian territories were 13 years ago. So there is no democracy anymore in the Palestinian territories, and in the Arab world, neither. Israel is really succeeded. One of the big treasures of this country is, even with wars, a long war from 48 to today, we had 10 explosions of this war with 3 intifadas, 3 Palestinian uprisals, and even like this with terrorism. Look, I want you just to give you an example. I have 3 kids. I live in the most peaceful area in Israel, in the center of Israel, not far from here. And from my 3 kids, 2 of them were victims of terror attacks. That was quite amazing. That happens in the beginning of the year, between the year 2000 and the year 2006. There was a discotheque not far from here, near the beach, the Dolphinarium. And my daughter, Dana, was on her way with her friends when she was 17 at that time, just to go to dance in the discotheque. And by chance, before they got there, there was a huge explosion. A suicide bomber just came inside and killed 22 youngsters. That was not far from here, maybe 1 mile from here, 1.5 mile in that discotheque at that time. And I remember I was broadcasting abroad to the Spanish and TV, and they were telling me, please tell us what's going on. And I was with my cell trying to locate Dana, to know what happens with her. My son was in school, and he used to study cinema in high school here in Israel. You have the possibility of having a kind of a specialization, we say in English, I don't know if that's the right word. So he used to have cinema, and they were just producing a movie, and the girl who used to be with him, her name was Adar Hershkovitz, she went out to buy a falafel. You eat a falafel? And there was a suicide bomber who came, who exploded himself there. He killed her and himself. And so that's just to give you an idea of what happened here in the beginning of the century, of the 21st century. Today, the situation is completely different. And the third thing, which is maybe the most, I would say, present thing also in the Israeli debate, is the fact they are supporting today every terror group with certain importance in this area, including Hamas, starting with Hamas. By the way, Hamas are Sunnites, but why do they get support from the Shiites of Iran? Because they don't have someone else doing it. So sometimes Qatar supports them or gives them some money, but they get lots of help from Iran. And the Islamic Jihad, who is really a pro-Iranian, an Iranian organization, and mainly the main arm of Iran in the Middle East, which is Hezbollah in Lebanon. And Hezbollah in Lebanon is like a unit of the Iranian army, and they use them in that way, and they, you know, they are a huge problem for Israel too, because they cover with missiles the whole Israeli territory, and they have apparently almost 150,000 missiles. Hezbollah, an Iranian, I would say, arm against Israel. So it's really important to know them. So when we speak about the threats, and when we speak about the situation in the Middle East, we must take into account that if in the 20th century we had most of the Arab countries wishing to replace Israel, to destroy Israel, many of them today, as they said to me, see Israel as an enemy of Iran, an enemy of ISIS and of Al-Qaeda, all the jihadi groups, and they say we have a common interest. We here should fight together against them. So that's the first reason why things changed in the Middle East in a very, is it clear? Common enemies. That's the first reason. The second reason is, and that was amazing, one of the Arab leaders told me that, and I was amazed. He said, you remember that in 1973, there was a war here, the Yom Kippur War. The Arabs called it the October War. In the day of Yom Kippur, which is the day, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, when most of the Jews fast and go to the synagogue, etc. That day, October 73, Israel was attacked by some Arab armies at the same time. It was a surprise for Israel. So one of the Arab generals said to me, you know, already in 1973, in the October War, we understood that we don't have a military option against Israel. And I said, why? He said, because the Jews, they say the Jews normally, arrived to the war on their knees. We surprised them in that attack. But some weeks afterwards, they won the war. And Israel today is much stronger than it was at that time in 1973. So there is no military option for us against Israel. So we should find other options. So that's the second reason. The third reason, they said, Israel is the startup nation. We should take the technologies that Israel have today and use them also for our benefit. The Saudis are building a new city in Sinai called, not in the Red Sea. They are building a new city called Neom with $500 billion budget. They need technologies. It will be a very modern city. Israel is one of the countries that can help to do all these things because we have these state-of-the-art technologies here. So they want Israeli technology. And there is something else that nobody speaks about. And remember this. 70% of the Saudi population, and in general in the Arab world, are under 30. For them, the wars that I was talking about, the 6 Days War, the 73 War, are like the Romans' wars, are like history. And for them, they look forward and they say, okay, enough is enough. Let's go on and let's do something else. So that's the explanation that I get in the Arab country to the fact that today they accept, some of them, the Israeli existence as a state, as a sovereign state in this area, and they even think that we should reach some kind of cooperation. Now this cooperation is happening, but is under the radar in many countries. I can see things are happening. There is a kind of a triangle also, by the way, with the United States. I don't know if you know, but in some weeks' time, there will be an event here in Israel, which is amazing. That it will be something that I never thought it would happen. America, United States, Russia, and Israel together debating here about the threat of Iran. That's something that it's really unprecedented, and it will happen in some weeks in Jerusalem. So it's important. Things are changing in the area. The threats, these threats, and the Iranian threat is imposing many concepts that would be completely unthinkable in the past. Now, Before I go to the questions, I want to tell you something. If we take the Muslim world today on the whole, these 1.6 billion people, we should divide them into 4 groups. The first group is the Iranians and the Shiites that, in a way, today are trying, they succeeded saving their client, President Assad, in Syria. It was a big success for them. But at the same time, they still work like a superpower. They have the Revolutionary Guards with $6 billion working all over the Middle East and trying to create a mini, I would say, power in the area, starting with Lebanon, with Hezbollah, as we talked before, Syria with Assad. They have Iraq in Baghdad. They are Shiites today, and they are like relatives for Iran. They have Sana, the Houthis in Yemen, and they have now Hamas in Gaza. And they are working with all these people to create more and more influence in the area, and they are a big concern for all the others, the majority, and also for Israel. But Iranians have a problem. Be aware of that. If you read a little bit what's going on inside Iran, you'll discover that there is a huge crisis, the biggest crisis ever since the beginning of the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. They have 2 billion drugged people. Sorry, 2 million drugged people in Iran. 1 million women, 1 million men. They have the highest rate of AIDS in the world, in Iran. They have demonstrations everywhere because the sanctions, the American, the international sanctions, are really hurting them very, very deeply. So there are demonstrations today everywhere in Iran against the regime for the first time. I remember in 2009 there were demonstrations in Tehran. Now they are everywhere in the country. So something is happening in Iran, and we don't know. They play outside like nothing happened, but inside the society is suffering, is changing, and I say, cherchez la femme, look for the women. Women will change many things in general in the Muslim world, and I believe that in Iran they feel threatened by the regime and they feel punished by the regime. So the first group, the Shiites and Iran. The second group, the Muslim Brothers. That's a movement that was created in 1929 in Egypt by a gentleman called Hassan el-Banna. And it was a reaction to the fact that the Suez Canal was being built by the British and before by the French, and they brought the Western culture to Egypt, and they were against this modern culture that was in a way changing, that in a way was changing the society. The Muslim Brothers became a factor in politics in the Middle East since the beginning of the revolutions in the Arab world. They got power in Egypt. They got some power in Morocco and in Tunisia, but they lost everywhere. The only place where they succeeded is Turkey. Turkey is the only place, a NATO member, who has a leader, President Erdogan, who is a member of the Muslim Brothers. And he's still there, and he wants to bring Turkey to something that some people call an Islamic Republic in 1923, when they will have 100 years of the revolution of Ataturk, who was a secular revolution, and maybe they will become an Islamic state. You know, there was, I don't know if you heard about Bernard Lewis, who was a scholar from Princeton. He used to come to Israel very often. He was brilliant. I think he was the best scholar ever on Middle Eastern subjects. And he told me an incredible sentence. He said to me, in 10 years' time, I believe Iran will become Turkey, and Turkey will become Iran. So there will be a change. Now, we don't know if it will happen or not, and he will not going to, he's not here. He's not staying here to tell us if it's, we can't ask him if he's right or not, because he passed away. He was 103 years ago, 103 years age, but we still have his books, and all his research. Anyway, the third group, and I will finish now, Ben, the third group is the jihadi groups. We spoke a lot about that. They didn't disappear, Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and they still are there. And the fourth group is the Sunnite world that we were talking about before, that bring us today certain new opportunities to the Middle East. Israel is probably one of the main achievements of the world in the last 100 years. I will tell you only one last example. The Pope told me in a recent audience 3 months ago, he asked me, tell me, Henrique, how did it happen that Hebrew became a language that you speak in the streets, that you have in the media, that you have everywhere? And I told him, look, Pope Francis, I believe it is like if tomorrow morning you decide that Latin will be the official language in all the Spanish and Portuguese speaking world. And Latin, which is a language almost dead, used only for religious goals. I said, imagine that tomorrow you have in the social media people writing in Latin. You have games, I don't know, football, he likes football very much, being broadcast in Latin. Imagine insults in Latin. Imagine kids in the kindergarten speaking in Latin. That's exactly what happened with Hebrew here in the last 100 years. And that's only one aspect of the Israeli achievements of the Jewish people in this area. Ben-Gurion, I started with him, I will finish with him. He said once, the difficult things, we do them immediately. The impossible ones take a little bit longer. Thank you very much. And now we have questions. Yes, please.
Sir, Cadet Baker, United States Military Academy. You mentioned that the Egyptians are Israel's enemies. So I was curious, what is your opinion on the new state solution requiring that it works with Egyptians to come to a solution? So
no, not at all. I didn't explain myself properly.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. The question is if Egypt is an enemy of Israel? No, not at all, not at all. I think Egypt is an ally. I think that Egypt, you must understand, Egypt is 1/4 of the Arab world. It's almost 100 million people. It's, in a way, it's the United States of the Arab world. Everything that happens there has an immediate influence in other countries in the Arab world. The Arabs are almost 400 million people, and they look into Egypt as something really important for them. So I think that Egypt today has a very, very important strategic relation with Israel, and mainly President Sisi, and very close. There is a phone working 24 hours a day between Cairo and Jerusalem, a red phone. So that's really important to understand. And I believe, quoting foreign sources, that Israel helps Egypt in Sinai in the fight against jihadi groups there too. Now, about the new state solution. I believe that we need two things to see something like the new state solution being accepted. One is the Egyptian acceptance agreement, which is critical, and I think it is possible to get this support from Egypt, because Egypt has lots of economic difficulties, and also for them, Gaza is a problem. So for them having them as neighbors and having Hamas really controlling this small territory, which is a kind of island of instability also for them, not only for Israel. So I believe they would have an interest, a very direct interest to solve this problem. I see it as more problematic in the West Bank. I think to convince Palestinians in the West Bank will take time. I think there are no impossible things. I think that here we need a lot of creativity, not to think out of the box, to bring new boxes. That's the only possibility. So this is a new box, the new state solution, and maybe something that today looks very difficult to implement, maybe in 5-10 years, it will be something realistic. Yes, please.
Cadet Lopez from the Virginia Military Institute. You said that the Arab world's working with Israel now because they have common interests and everything. So what happens when the Iran situation's done and you think that Israel is going to be the main target again? Or?
So, yeah, if Israel will be the main target, if the Iranian problem, the Iranian issue is solved in the future, well, unfortunately, I hope it will be solved. I hope there will be a political change in Iran. I hope they will become a democratic country. I think Iranians are a very important people, a very developed and educated people. So I hope they can do better than this kind of incredible, unthinkable regime they have today. They hang homosexuals, they really discriminate women. I met in a conference recently in Estoril in Portugal, Nobel Prize, Iranian Nobel Prize, Shirin Ebadi, and she said to me, I'm a judge, I was a judge in the court. You know that the weakness of 2 women is equivalent to 1 man. So imagine that happens in 2019, that's really unthinkable. I don't think that this pragmatic Arab world will change their attitude afterwards. I think we'll have common interests if we get there, but we need to solve the Palestinian issue before. Not because they are so worried with the Palestinians, but because their public opinion is. If there is a war in Gaza, you can see millions of people demonstrating in the streets, and that's in a way a threat for this kind of regimes. So I believe they will try to motivate, and that's the deal of the century of President Trump, for instance, they will try to motivate agreements between Israel and the Palestinians, also to help to develop and to normalize the relations between Israel and parts of this Arab world. But I wouldn't be surprised, and that's what I've been said in Oman last week, that we'll have some new developments in the near future in the relations between Israel and those countries. Please.
Sir, Cadet Director from the United States Military Academy. So this is a bit of a more historical question. About 50 years ago, if one was to look at the Middle East, they'd see a lot of secular ideas like Ba'athism or like the Shah of Iran, who was attracting a lot of Western investment. How did the rise of Islamic radicalization, where did that arise from? What are its roots exactly, and why has that affected the Middle East? Why hasn't it continued on that trajectory of increased Westernization and secularization? Why did it instead go to Islamic radicalization?
Amazing question, but a very what happened with the radicalization in the Arab world? There were secular ideas 50 years ago, and today they were replaced in many countries by this Islamization you're talking about, Gregory. Look, it's a very complicated question. I think this is something we must learn and understand, because what is clear is that there was a kind of a revolution in that way, okay? Now, I believe we, the Western world, in many cases, we didn't really understand what happened in the Middle East. Many times we look to the Middle East with Western eyes, and we try to understand what's happening in the Arab world. For instance, the name I told you, Arab Spring. Arab Spring. How could you call Arab Spring to what happened in the Arab world? I mean, it was not a spring. It was something completely different. These were revolutions trying to change the regime, trying to fight against corruption, trying to bring democracy, trying to bring equality to women. But it's a different thing, because you don't have any kind of human rights in these countries. So in a way, I remember being in Tahrir Square in Egypt, in Cairo, at the beginning, and asking myself, what happened here? Why these revolutions now? And I understood the youngsters and the women that were demonstrating in the streets did it at that time because of social media. That was that huge megaphone that changed reality. In a way, it showed things that they didn't know about their own countries before. because it was in social media. By the way, in Iran, you were asking in Iran, in the last elections, the only way an Iranian had to know what's going on in their country was through social media, because the media is completely under censorship. So it's now, there are some factors that brought this Islamization related with different facts. One, we have 80 million unemployed youngsters in the Arab world. 80 million. Now, Islam brought a kind of an alternative also in the economic point of view. I'll tell you a short story. Elections in Egypt, I come to a butcher outside Cairo. The guy looks to me like a discotheque guy, modern, etc. And he has all the posters of the Islamic movement, of the Muslim brothers. Not brotherhood, brothers. And I asked him, why do you support the Muslim brothers? He said, because they were here to help my parents and my grandparents, bringing them food, bringing them medicaments, all kind of help that they needed, and the government was not here at that time. So this is one of the reasons. Now, they did a very good work in education. They brought all kinds of institutions, from universities to kindergartens and schools, trying to bring this Islamization to the people, and they succeeded. Now, even like this, I think that the Islamic radical groups are still a minority in the Muslim world. They are still a minority. The Salafi radical groups, experts think they are more or less between 8 and 10% of the populations. In general, in the Muslim world, we are still on time, but we must try to deal with them with their culture and not with ours. I think that the United States and other Western countries did huge mistakes trying to bring democracy, like an instant democracy, to some of these countries, thinking that the mere fact that you declare elections, it's enough. You have elections, that's democracy. No, elections, it's the end of a democratic process, not the beginning. You can't start with elections, because then the radicals will win, and they will declare the elections for the last time. They will not allow elections in the future. That was supposed to happen with the Muslim brothers in Egypt when they won. So we must be very careful. We must understand that something else. We must be very humble when we come and try to help the Middle East to solve their problems.
We have time for one last question.
Please.
Thank you, sir. Cadet Cymmerman from the United States Military Academy. You've mentioned multiple times about social media and kind of the democratization of the narrative, of like who controls the narrative. So I have a question for you. As a journalist, what do you feel the kind of responsibility of traditional journalists and how that's changed now that kind of with social media, the average person can kind of report what's going on, or at least influence how it's being reported? So do you feel that kind of role has changed as a traditional journalist?
How social media changed the traditional role of journalists. I want to tell you, I will take 3 minutes and I will tell you a seminar I do in the university in 3 minutes. We are in the place on earth with the highest proportion of foreign journalists per square meter. You have here in this small territory more than 1,000 foreign correspondents coming from more than 100 countries. 450 media outlets represented here. Now, I was a very bad student in physics, but I remember in quantum physics that when you observe a phenomena, you change it. So imagine how this huge presence of media in this area changed reality in these 70, 71 years since the independence of the State of Israel. This is a weapon. Exactly like an F-15, exactly like a tank. Even more lethal sometimes. I saw how the Arab Spring, the Arab Revolution, spread all over, from Tunisia at the beginning to Iraq and Syria and many countries all over the Middle East, only with this. And all the youngsters had the pictures that happened in Tunisia or in Tahrir Square in Cairo in their phones. So media is very, very important to understand what happens in the Middle East and how did it happen and will it happen? Now, today we have this new factor. Today, in the last decade, I would say, the fact we have social media is was a kind of a threat for traditional journalists at the beginning. Today, it changed the pace of events completely. You know, in Israel, we have the reputation of being obsessed with news. We used to have, before social media, every 30 minutes news in the radio. And everybody just stopped and listened to the news at that time. Now we have news every 5 seconds, not every 30 minutes. So we must adapt ourselves. The last time I was with the Pope, Mark Zuckerberg, the inventor of Facebook, was inside with his wife. And he went out, and the Pope introduced him to me, and he said, to introduce Henrique Cymmerman, my friend, etc. And he said to me in Spanish, you know, este chico, which means this boy, he said, he didn't understand what he did to the world. And that was told by a gentleman 82 years old. And he's right. I think we don't understand what social media did to the world. Everything is changing. Everything will change even more. Not only in our lives, in our personal lives, also in politics, also in geopolitics. The gentleman that I met last week in Oman told me, I follow you in Facebook. I heard you have lectures in kibbutz in the north and the south of the country. And he's in the Sultanate of Oman, in the end of the Persian Gulf, in front of Iran, of an island called Kish. So the world changed, and we must be aware of that. We have quite a challenge in that point of view also, but media was there, is there, and will be there, even changing the character of media. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.